PPI, involvement and engagement. This is going to be the highlight of the day, okay? You will not forget this session. So I'm GJ Melendez-Torres. I'm Associate Director of the School for Public Involvement and Engagement, and I'm really pleased to be joined with some of my very favorite public partners, as well as PI&E academics in the school, to talk a little bit about the profile of public involvement and engagement in QQ3. So we're going to hear a bit from my colleague Hameed, who will share some of his reflections on the value and importance of involvement and engagement in the school. And then Margaret and myself, joined by Kath and Ella, will introduce the refreshed involvement and engagement strategy for 2023 to 2027. And then our colleague Alan will lead us in an exercise, a think, pair, share exercise, to think about some of the ways that we can bring the strategy home to the work that we're doing in involvement and engagement across the school as well. So without further ado, Hameed, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, hi. First of all, I'd like to say that it's great that we're starting on a positive note, that we've got diversity in the room, because I think I have been in spaces where I'm the only probably Asian person at times, or I'm the only LGBT person at times, or I'm the only person who's had mental health issues, or I'm the only carer. But I've noticed throughout the day that we've got people here from all walks of life. So I think the good thing is we can say we kind of cracked it halfway. So that's nice that we're not starting from the beginning. And what I'd like to say is that why is diversity important in research? And I think for many, many years, I noticed that we talked about diversity around delivering services and importance for shaping, designing services. But when it came to research, it almost felt like it was for people who are a particular background, like middle class, articulate. They had to have an interest in research. And actually, the people that research has an impact on are those people who are not usually seen around the table. And I tend to not use the word hard to reach, because I think straight away we make assumptions that people are running away from us and we're chasing them. And I think I can relate to that from a child as a teenager growing up, where people used to say, oh, the Chinese community, they really want to live away from everybody and you can never find them. And the more you look for them, the more harder it becomes. And actually, that wasn't the case. The case was that they were running Chinese takeaways in our local community. So how could it be that they were not able to be reached? And also, there was an assumption that they were not willing to mingle with us. But the fact is, nobody actually found out what are the common interests that we have with the Chinese community. So it's easier if, for example, I'm from a Muslim background, it's easy for me to connect with an African Muslim on the basis we might meet at the mosque. If I'm from an Asian background and I have a different religion, but I can still connect with the Sikh community based on food or clothes. So with the Chinese community, I think there was just not this kind of effort to kind of think, what can we connect on? Because we didn't share foods or lifestyle. But as I got older, I realized, and I applied that into the research world and thought, that's what's happening in research, that we make assumptions that certain communities are not reachable, and then we just kind of think, what can we do? They just don't want to engage with us. So I've parked the word hard to reach, and I've kind of also parked the word seldom heard. I think seldom heard tends to, for me, it feels quite like you're a victim and you're kind of very marginalized, and that's why I try not to use the word seldom heard. I think I tend to use, I've created this word, I don't know if it makes sense, but I always say non-traditionally engaged groups, because I think not everybody who does not engage with us is marginalized. So my mom is very marginalized, and I accept that. She doesn't speak English. She has multiple health conditions. She has mental health issues. She's an elderly person. So I understand she's not digital. But my brother and sisters, they're not marginalized. They're articulate. They've got professions. They've gone through the university process. They've got good jobs. But yet they're not engaging when it comes to research. Because every time I bring it up, they're like, how can you go and sit in a meeting all around a table? Don't you get bored? It's enough for us doing that as a paid job. And we wouldn't want to do anything like that extra. And they pull faces at me. So I started to think about it. Actually, instead of saying they're not interested and they're not keen and they don't pay attention, I've twisted that around and thought, well, actually, what can we do to make it interesting for those people and say, actually, it's worth you coming around that table, and it's not as boring as you think, because we don't just talk and go away. We actually develop a lot of actions that come from it, that changes people's lives, that influences positive impact on people. So actually, by you not being there, you're actually doing injustice to somebody else, because you could have been a representative for a certain community or a certain. So, like, for example, my sister, it took her 8 years to get pregnant. She's gone through IVF. Now, if there was a project around IVF, or maternity or parenthood, she would be perfect, because she could really kind of share some of the challenges that she's faced. And if services get better for people who access IVF through NHS, she can see that because of her input, there's been a positive change. So I'm trying to change their thinking by saying, actually, think about the wider picture. By you saying, I don't want to get involved, you're actually saying, I can't be bothered to see future changes for others. And I know it sounds quite harsh and it sounds quite blunt, but I think with family members, you can be a bit more politically incorrect and you can say as it is. So what I'd like to say, going back to diversity, is that this is my humble request to everybody in this room, that please don't be afraid of political correctness. And wherever I go now, I make very clear and I say, look, I'm going to take part, but I can't be pussyfooting around everybody because I'm too afraid of political correctness. I said, I'm not going to let that creativity die in me. I'm not going to let that innovative thinking die in me, because I'm thinking if I say it this way, then that person's going to, or if I say it that way. What I do emphasize very strongly is be very mindful that you're not politically being offensive. And I think there's a big difference between political correctness and political offensiveness. Now, I like it when I make mistakes, because that's how I became who I became today, and I'm more open to diversity, I'm more welcoming to everyone, I'm more inclusive, because I've said the wrong things, I've been challenged, and then I've been able to see from a different perspective. But now we're too afraid to say something, so if we're not being challenged and we hold certain views, no one's there to shift our view. So I think that don't be afraid, say what you're feeling, but just be mindful that you're not doing in a way deliberately to be derogative or patronizing in that context. So as a gay man, I think probably not as an Asian person or a Muslim person, but particularly as a gay person from different communities, not just my own community or from a Western community, I tend to find that I get caught very much in people who go right into political offensiveness. And I would have been happy if they were more into the political correctness and asked me directly than to offend me, you know. So someone says to me things like, but how can you be gay and be Muslim? You know, are you the top or bottom? I'm like, you don't have to be both of them to be gay. Gay means I'm attracted to men. It doesn't, I don't fancy women. How do you know that you don't fancy if you haven't tried it? I say, well, did you try with the same sex before you knew you were heterosexual? Oh, no, but that's... So I think that even though they think they're doing... But sometimes it can be quite painful and hurtful, because you're thinking, you know... And also another thing is that this is where I want to go with this political offensiveness, is that if, for example, somebody was opening up about themselves to me, I will still respect the boundaries of who they are. What I find is that sometimes people cross the boundaries with me and ask me, so what do you do in bed? And I'm like, I never sit at home and think, when I speak to a straight person, I wonder what they did with their partner yesterday. I wonder how they do with their partner. It doesn't concern me. But why is it when I say about my sexuality, suddenly it's just about sex and not me as a whole person? And that's because people go straight into political offensiveness, rather than saying to me, look, you're the first person I met who's Muslim, who's gay, who's Pakistani. Can you tell me a bit about yourself? Or can you just, I have a few questions, and is it okay? I'll be happy with that, but you could tell they do it on a purpose to really kind of offend you. Particularly this one is the one that really hurts me the most, when they say, well, you can't be Muslim if you're gay, and that kind of hurts me. So I went off the topic just for a reason for that, is just to kind of emphasize that when you work with people, you're going to get people from all walks of life, and sometimes it's very easy to not realize what's being said. I remember I went to one project, and it was a meeting in Oxford. And when the meeting finished, I had food left, and it was Ramadan. So I thought, well, I'll take some and have it on the way, because I'm going to be opening fast. And there was another person who was a PPI member. Thank goodness it wasn't a professional. I'm not saying it was still correct what they did, but at least it gave me a bit of comfort. Doesn't matter, they're probably on a learning journey. He was a lot older man, maybe in his 60s. And he said to me, oh, have you got a big family to feed at home? Are you taking the food for them? And I was just taken back. And he made that assumption because of my color. And he probably thought because, later on when I started to speak to him, it was almost like he had this assumption that I must have been a refugee who's claimed asylum and I've got a big family at home and this is great. And when I said, no, I don't have a family, I'm gay, it was almost like, oh, you can't be Asian and be gay because that doesn't fit well together. And then you also say you're Muslim because you're fasting. So that's where it's really important just to be mindful that when you have people coming to you, that what you say and how you say it to them. So that's that part. I'm now going to focus back on research because I think I've taken you all over the place. That's just my activist side of me. So in terms of research, I think we can't continue and we cannot afford to continue to do research with only a particular type of people. We are a population of 72 million people. I think I always say to people, why go around the world when you can come to England and you have every world here? I mean, if you come to Birmingham, I can take you to Pakistan, I can take you to India, Bangladesh, Greece, you name it. There's like streets, dedicated to different cultures with the food, the clothes, the shopping, the religious places. So if that is what UK is, particularly England, and I'll focus on one city, Birmingham, then how can we just do research based on a certain particular groups and exclude others? Because research has an impact on everyone. Like COVID, it didn't discriminate. It didn't say, okay, you're Asian, we'll leave you alone. Cancer doesn't discriminate. But when we come to doing research on these things, we tend to find people of a particular ethnicity, particular background, or we even might get different ethnic backgrounds, but we don't look at within that the differences. So let's give you an example here. Somebody gets really excited and says to me, I need people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic community. Easiest community target are usually affluent Indian community and I'm making a quick bit of a sweeping statement just to get to the point. I'm not saying it's always like that, but just to get to the point. And Nigerian people are quite affluent, educated. But what people say to me is, oh, I've got Black representation, I've got Asian representation. I'm like, well, what about those underrepresented Bangladeshi community? That's where the main issues are. What about the Pakistani community? That's where the issues are. Oh, I say we need them because they're the ones that are very rare we see around the table. What we tend to do is we tend to go for the same people over and over again and make ourselves feel better that we've got diversity in the room. So when you come to do your project, really think deep, who do you really want around the table? And also, when you come to doing I'm involved with the project in Oxford, and I want to say very proudly, with the Biomedical Research Centre, and they've actually created a diversity in research group, and we're part of that. There's about 12 of us. So people who do research, they bring their projects to us, they talk it through, and we give them advice on how to go around inclusion, diversity, and all this kind of stuff. So you could do something similar in your departments or in your organizations. So where I'm going with this is that it's really important to be mindful that best way to do is to create a character. This is something that stayed with me. Somebody said this to me, and I thought, wow, I never thought of this, is to create a character that's got every single barrier that you could think of. They're blind, they're deaf, they've got, they're in a wheelchair, they're Black, they're gay, they've got a religious belief, and then work backwards, because you're most likely to at least get 80% of accessibility right. But what we tend to do is we create the average person, and then we base accessibility on that person. And then we realize, oh, we haven't thought about the person with hearing, but oh, we haven't thought about the person. And I want to go into a very simple detail. I lived in Manchester, and we were doing an event, and they had a Jewish community that was coming to this event, and nobody asked them very openly about their dietary requirements. They just assumed that they'll be okay with vegetarian food. Oh, I know they eat certain meat, but we'll just offer a vegetarian. When they arrived, the fact is that they eat kosher food and they only eat from plates. They have not touched any other non-kosher, as plates that have not been touched by non-kosher food before. Now, these plates were already being used. The pots had been already used, or the trays, the microwave. So they were sitting there saying, we can't eat. And it was a very simple thing. All they had to do was speak directly to one person from the Jewish community and work with them. If there was no Jewish caterers around to meet those needs, they could have just said, by the way, we don't have access to kosher food, but we'd like to offer you a £10 reimbursement for your lunch. Please bring your lunch with you. And I think they would have been over the moon, the fact that they've been thought of. So it's even like something really small like this that you have to really, really take into account by making sure that no one is made to feel that they're a bother. I think that's the problem. Sometimes people don't come forward because they think they're going to be a bother. And we've got to change that thinking and say, you're not a bother. Actually, we're delighted to have you. And that's the way we've got to look at it. Because I think sometimes my mom, when I try to encourage her to get, she says, oh, no, but I'll be a bother for them because you said they'll have to get an interpreter, translator, they'll have to get me a taxi because this. And almost she thinks that, but when she's taken part in a few things, she's seen how welcome and her views have been valued through the interpreter saying what she shared. Because she's very queen bee. I think my mom can fix the NHS in 20 minutes if you speak to her in her own language. She can really fix the NHS in 20 minutes. So sometimes we're not disabled. It's the environment that makes us disabled, because you just change the language and she can fix the NHS. As soon as you speak to her in English, she can't ask you for a cup of tea. It's that kind of level. So I wanted to kind of emphasize on that point. And finally, what I would like to say to all of you is that we're not here to get it perfect. I think I felt more at ease with myself and more comfortable when I lived a life in ignorance, because I knew it all. I would go places, I'll give it large, I knew it all, I know it. But as I dipped and threw myself in the deep end of knowledge, I realized how little I know. And the worst fear is the more you learn, the more you realize the less you know, which is great. So what I'm saying is that don't feel that you've got to get it perfect, and don't feel that you're on this journey alone. What you just got to say is, if I'm doing something different every time, at least I've done something different to make a difference for somebody. So for me, I always try to, wherever I go, because I know it's very rare that we hear Muslim gay men views. There are gay men in the Muslim community, regardless whether they come forward. So I try to bring that forward. And also men with mental health issues, When I go to my gym, I see people are more happy to talk to me, straight men particularly, about physical health, so open about it. They're going, but when it comes to mental health, it's taken so long, and they still say with embarrassment, with shyness. So I try to I make that little pledge to myself, at least if I can make a difference for these two communities to start with, it's better than not making no difference at all. So I'm going to finish because I know of time, I might be running over, is what I will say to you is that we're all in it together, and we need to be in it together. So let's find a way to just bounce and communicate ideas. When we do something, if it works, share it with everybody and celebrate it. Thank you.
So thank you, Hameed, for that really just important reflection on the role of diversity in the involvement engagement work that we do in the school. We're now going to talk a little bit about the refresh strategy for 2023-2027. And one of the things that we're really proud of about that strategy was the degree of co-production that we undertook in order to make sure that we had a strategy that reflected the range of perspectives both across the school, but also across our substantial and really diverse network of public partners. So because we want to start from the very beginning, I'm now going to invite my colleague Margaret to just speak a little bit about the co-production aspects that really went into the strategy before we introduce the pillars of the strategy itself. So, Margaret?
Can I first of all say a big thank you to Hameed for speaking so passionately about diversity. A presentation without notes and coming straight from the heart. It was fabulous. I'm Margaret. I'm a friend and colleague of Hameed, and I've been doing PPI for 15 years. I started off in the health networks, mainly cancer and dementia, and then I got into public health, and my first work was with Matt Egan, who I've just seen earlier today, and we've had a good catch-up. I then went into social care, so I now do the whole ball game. So, yeah, co-production, there are plenty of definitions out there, and I Googled some, but I just decided they were all too theoretical to bring today. I suppose for me, co-production means that sharing and developing and producing outputs from research. And a good example would be as a co-applicant. I've had that role many times. It was hard to get in the first instance, but I got it in a project called Champ One with York, and I've never looked back since. So a co-applicant on a research team who's involved right from the very outset in the research. And tasks may be helping to write the plain English summary, and in some cases, pulling together a PPI package and reviewing a full application. And I always find that pre-submission stage very interesting. It never becomes quite as intense as that, I think, because you're just aware that you might not get funding. And it can involve IT, and anybody who's been on the new Realms system on the CCF, I'll know the challenges for PPI members on that, because we asked to write a biog and to list our publications and to list our grants. Now, at first, that wasn't a problem because I didn't have any. But as time's gone on, of course, I've got a big list of both, and I often need help doing that IT. So there's then the wider PPI group, and they are what I call the layers of PPI. Quite often the co-applicancy role, the PPI group, like a wider PPI group, and also community of interest. That seems to be the three layers. That model is quite often used. And the wider group, they might be involved with looking at sheets, participant-facing sheets, ensuring any papers are written in understandable English and produced in appropriate formats. Where co-production really gets interesting for me is when I'm asked to do some of the more intense tasks. More exciting, more dynamic. Systematic reviewing, thematic analysis, writing publications, and delivering training, sometimes to other PPI members and sometimes to early career researchers. I'm going to give an example of a project where there was great co-production, and I was really moved by this project. I wanted to touch on diversity, but not from the aspects that Hameed's come from. I wanted to talk about the homelessness. I am a volunteer with the homeless, so I've got a big interest there. So this project was one of Newcastle University projects, and the topic is trauma amongst homeless people. The researcher has a real commitment and motivation to co-production. I was pleasantly surprised when I first met her and she suggested some training on systematic reviewing. She did this in small groups using the Rayon platform, and we learned how to include and exclude abstracts. She even offered me a buddy, so I had a member of the homeless community who I could tap into, and he really helped me. So she did the training in small groups, and she had one-to-one meetings in order to reach consensus. Later we received the full papers, followed again by one-to-one meetings to reach consensus. For me, this was just taking co-production to a brand new level. And I was so moved by her commitment that I nominated her for an award, and not surprisingly, she was successful. Regarding the strategy, I was involved quite early on. and that was with Lancaster University. And I remembered speaking to Jenny and a lady called Michelle Collins about branding. This was where I felt the school had a weakness. And at times, I really didn't know who I was working for. Was it Newcastle? Was it Fuse? Was it Lancaster? Was it Exeter? I just didn't really know at times, and I would have to ask Mirella Andreeva, who is someone who works with Matt Egan, and I would have to ask her advice when I was going to do a presentation, just to go through, you know, the projects which belonged and had the ownership of the school. And I was keen for a full PI&E evaluation, and I mentioned this to both Jenny and Michelle. I wasn't really hopeful that they'd take me up on that, because it never usually happens when I say it. But by that time, I'd done PPI evaluation 4 times, and I'd found it a really fulfilling experience. So I was thrilled when the school decided to embark on a full PPI evaluation across the school. And I was keen to be involved personally, where before I'd been involved in the later stages of evaluation. This time, Michelle gave me the opportunity of being involved in the cube. So that was right at the very beginning. And the researchers had the idea that they would give a small group of PPI members sort of the ownership of that piece of the evaluation. And I thought that was a really effective and also an equality of opportunity approach, in that everybody was given the chance to be involved in the evaluation. Not everybody was interested in it. If it's not your thing, that's fair enough. But just the fact that the school were adopting that equality of opportunity. So I will say a big thank you to the school for all the opportunities they've given me over the years, and in more recent years to Fuse, who I can see there are some members from Fuse here as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Margaret. So as Margaret said, you know, one of the most important things that we had coming into QQ3 was the evaluation of involvement and engagement that was led by Michelle Collins and Jenny. Jenny, you're here, right? Hi, Jenny. Yeah, by Michelle and Jenny, and that was pretty foundational in terms of informing our thinking about where we're going to take the strategy next. Using that as a starting point, we then undertook a process of co-production with public partners, including Margaret, in order to develop and iterate the next part of the strategy for I&E in the school. We communicate this in a range of ways, including you said we did, and I think we're really proud of the outcome of that strategy, which we organized as being around 4 pillars. Those 4 pillars briefly, and Kath and Ella will speak about this shortly, are involving everyone, involving everywhere, impacting evidence, and evidencing impact. Involving everyone really represents our core commitment to equity and diversity across a breadth of engagement, including drawing on many of the learnings, such as the ones that Hameed shared earlier today. Involving everywhere also reflects our commitment to making sure that involvement and engagement is broadly accessible across the geography of the school. Impacting evidence speaks to our interest really in ensuring that involvement and engagement activities have research results and that we can capture what those impacts are on research. But also evidencing impact really speaks to the need to close the feedback loop, to ensure that we're reflecting back to the public partners who give us so much of their time, energy, and expertise, the ways that their inputs have meaningfully impacted and shaped our understanding in the course of doing public health research together. So I'm now going to invite my colleagues Kath and Ella to speak briefly about how these principles will come into practice across I&E in the school.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me today, and thank you as well to Margaret and Hameed for speaking before. It's great to see so many people here today. My name is Ella Anderson and I'm the Public Involvement Engagement Manager with Fuse. Fuse is the Centre for Translational Research in Public Health and is a founding member of the School for Public Health Research. So I'm here today to say a few words about the new strategy that GJ's just introduced and how that might look in practice. And I'm going to be focusing on the first pillar of involving everyone. So while there's a lot of brilliant activity going on in Fuse right now, there's only time for one example. And what I'd like to focus on today is the Fuse podcast, which is called Public Health Research and Me. So this free podcast is led by Fuse Public Partners and aims to bridge the gap that sometimes exists between research and how it reaches our wider public audiences. You probably can't see, but at the bottom we do have a QR code, and at the stand at the back we've also got a QR code if anyone wants to download and have a listen. So the Fuse podcast group first met back in May 22 last year after we shared an SPHR funded training opportunity with everyone in our public partner network. So lived experience and characteristics such as age, employment status, ethnicity, health status and background vary from person to person in our public partner network. But one thing that everyone does have in common is an interest and enthusiasm for getting involved in public health research. Our public partners showed a genuine interest in the podcast training, and we were also fortunate to be able to extend the opportunity to a few of our early career researchers as well. Together, we undertook training with an experienced science communicator, and we learned how to prepare, record, edit, share, and promote a podcast. After the training, we arranged an interactive podcast planning session where we could apply our newfound knowledge and work out what we would like our own podcast to sound like. We co-developed a podcast planning document and agreed that the podcast would be hosted by one of the public partners. The idea was that the host would be able to ask the guests, who are typically Fuse researchers, the questions that people really did want to ask them about their work. The public partner host has a really important role. They'll typically read around the subject area, they'll develop questions, they'll run these past our podcast group, tweak accordingly, and then lead on the episode's overall direction. Where relevant, they'll also draw on their own lived experiences, and this can help the listener feel as though they're part of a conversation, and it makes the podcast more engaging and inclusive. After completing the recording and sorting out the first major edits, a first version is shared with the public partner podcast group. And following the final edits, the episode will then be launched. And to make it easier to find and listen to, it's also available on all the major streaming platforms such as Spotify, Apple, Google and Amazon, or whichever ones you like to use. The podcast group have been instrumental in the dissemination of the podcast through their own network, family and friends, which has been a really important part of promoting it. As well as involving everyone in the podcast group, we'd also like to think that the podcast involves the listeners. Our podcast delivers content that is relevant and relatable to a diverse audience, meaning that everyone is involved in the conversation. Public involvement engagement is a key focus of the podcast, and it creates opportunities for our guests to demonstrate how they've embedded lived experience in their research and helps to show everyone how this has helped to shape their work and their research. We hope that listeners see the Public Health Research and Me podcast as a convenient way to learn something new. As with any podcast, you can listen on the go or when commuting, exercising or at home. This level of accessibility means that the podcast can reach people who might not have the time or ability to sit down and read an article or watch a video, although we do have a subtitled video of our first podcast episode, if anyone's interested. We've had many useful conversations with members of different communities about how to make the podcast even more accessible. And this has led us to generate transcripts for each episode, and this is something that we'll continue to do as we go on. We also encourage feedback and reviews from listeners after each episode, and this also helps us to learn and improve. We know the podcast can involve everyone, but this needs us to work hard together to create inclusive content that is sensitive to diverse perspectives and experiences. Having a range of voices represented both by our guests and hosts is important, and we're also fortunate that public health research offers such a wide variety of interesting topics. Guests so far include Cassie Muir, speaking with public partner and host Victoria Bartle about the research on social and emotional resilience in children and young people affected by parental substance use. We also hosted an episode with former Director of Public Health, Professor Eugene Milne. And in our latest episode, out this week, Victoria talks with Joanne McGrath about women's experiences of homelessness and the impact that this has on their health. From my own perspective, the podcast has been an absolute joy to work on. It's still very early days and we're all learning as we go along, but we're doing this together. It's been a highly rewarding experience, and I'll hand over to Kath now, but if anyone has any questions about the podcast or how we've done that, then I'll be at the Fuse stand later on. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Kath Maguire. I'm with Sphere in Exeter, but I'm based in Cornwall, so I've come diagonally as far as I could come to get here. And I'm going to start off by thinking about involving everywhere, and that's very much linked to the involving everyone that Ella was just talking about, because it's very easy for us to get hooked on engaging with communities that are linked already to our institutions. And we need to think actually beyond the centres where there are universities, and getting out into places where people are, rather than inviting them to our table. How can we actually move out into the communities and talk to them? And very much in the way that Steph was talking about in health inequalities this morning. So it's about turning our thoughts around. So instead of thinking about community leaders or community contacts we have as gatekeepers, thinking of them as bridges into the communities that we can use to help us move out of where we are into the places where other people are. The slides, which I know half of you can't see, but never mind, I'm sure they'll be available somewhere else, are just pictures of us going in different places and meeting with different people. There we go. The next pillar, I think, talking about is impacting evidence. And in order to impact evidence, we need to think about how and when and who we're involving to make a difference to that evidence. And I hesitate to disagree with Margaret on anything, because I know she has a great wealth of experience. But one of my big bugbears is this idea that you must always involve the public at the very beginning of the research. If the research is a circle, it doesn't have a beginning. You must involve people where you are, and where you're starting from is the point where you are at this moment, and thinking about how you do that, and how the way you are engaging with people is going to change your processes and what you're going to do and what evidence you're going to develop. That's a really important thing to be thinking about. And finally, thinking about evidencing impact. This is about ensuring that you do the process of understanding what people are saying to you, recording that, and thinking about what you're doing differently because of that engagement you've had with people. And that's a really important thing for you to be recording in the way you work. It's important to feed that back to public partners. It's important for us to publish that in our work. Every year I run a special studies unit for medical students who tell me that there is no public involvement in diabetes research, because they've looked at the literature and nobody's writing up what they've done in public involvement. Whereas we know there is a huge amount of public involvement in all sorts of research, and they're not finding it because it's not getting written into our publications. We need to do that. We also maybe need to think about actually what other types of impact of involvement in research having. One of our public engagement network, who was involved with Public Health England on a project looking at tick-borne diseases, then went on to teach how to protect nature volunteers from ticks in the community, because from that engagement with researchers She learned how important it was and how simple things like wearing long trousers instead of shorts when you're going out into nature could make a difference. And that sort of impact is really easily just completely missed. And we maybe need to think about how are we talking to our public partners about what difference being engaged with us is having for them? How are they taking the evidence they learn from working with us back into their communities? And I think that's something that maybe we just don't normally think about. Maybe we should be. Back to GJ.
Thanks very much. So it's after lunch. Your blood sugar's probably doing some kind of crazy things right now. So to get us moving, to get us thinking, Alan's going to lead us in a think, pair, share activity to think through how some of these strategy pillars can be useful in your own involvement and engagement. So, Alan?
No, I've never done one of these before, so if it all goes wrong, blame DJ. I will. Okay, we just got a little bit of an activity here. We're going to ask you to think. We're going to ask you to share with the person who's sitting next to you. And then later on, I think there are 3 questions, so we'll do that for each of them. And then depending on time and whatever, later on, hopefully you'll be able to give us a bit of feedback about what you've been talking and what your thoughts are. Is that okay? Cool, right. Next one. So, thinking about the strategy in relation to your own research, consider and discuss the following. Who do I need to involve? Now, 1 minute just thinking about that, so no talking. Come on. This is like a minute's silence, isn't it, at the beginning of it? It's not worked. Here it is. So, now, 2 minutes chatting to your neighbour.
So you're thinking you need...
Oh no, that's right. Who do I need to involve? That's the right one. My fault. I just press that, yeah?
Yeah, just press that and it'll move along. If it doesn't, just give us a nod and we can do it manually from our side.
Okay, thanks. Not running this time. Okay, okay, okay. Gosh, you're loud, you lot, when you get down to it. Can anybody whistle? You can. Hello? Hello, everybody. Thank you. Shush. 2 minutes are well and truly up. So, second question. How will I involve partners and when? I think we've already had that discussion, even if not a difference of opinion. But anyway, so another minute starts now, please. Shush, you're supposed to be thinking, not talking. Different noise this time. Is that nicer than the first one? Okay, now 2 minutes to discuss with your neighbour what you've been thinking this last minute. Shannon?
How many questions are there?
3. This are on the second of the 3 now. Okay. Right, now it's the third question, so please another minute's silence. What kind of approaches can I use? 1 minute's thinking time. Okay, everybody, last 2 minutes. You should have been thinking during that one, but I don't think you were. So, for another couple of minutes, just talking amongst yourselves, what kind of approaches can I use? And of course, there are many. Right, everybody, I'm going to cut it short there because we're running out short on time. So if it's okay with you, do you want to come back up, GJ? There are some microphones, well, there were this morning, so hopefully there still are. Would anybody like to sort of feed back a little bit of some of their thoughts, some of the things they've been talking about on any of those three questions? I heard a yes, yes. Was that... oh, we have somebody.
On? It's on. Excellent. Deepti and I actually work together on delivering a project that's co-produced, and we've just been thinking about how to increase ethnic diversity in our PPI group and in our sample as well. So we've just been strategizing around that, which has been interesting. And I've recently learned how to do coaching through a thing, so we've just been having a conversation like that to think about how we can, strategize based on the who, how, what, So it's been really useful, thank you.
Yeah, do you want to say anything about that?
Oh, no.
No. I know EDI is coming up as a subject after the break, isn't it? Sadly, I won't be here. I've got to dash off. But I think, personally, I have a son with a learning disability and autism and other things. When you think about EDI, think about people like him as well. It's not just about race. It's not just about et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's about people with disabilities, people who can't, people who need to be cared for, and so on and so forth. Don't forget them, please. Pardon? It's a community of people that's easy to forget about. It really is. Yes, and mental health as well. Anybody else? Gosh, you haven't been so silent since we started.
Okay, in terms of the how, I learned a long time ago about the participatory approach, doing a social mapping, operational mapping, going to the people, talking to the people, and asking people what the problem is, and generating the questions, the issues from the ground, and as per that, to develop the proposal, and again to share that proposal, the questions with the community, with those people. So getting feedback back and forth, that's how we can work with the community people.
A couple of things that I'm always thinking about is one of them in terms of co-production, treat everybody with equal respect. Listen to people, make them believe that they're being respected and properly, they are equal partners. And what was the other one? Oh yeah, when. You're both right. Right at the beginning and right the way throughout as well. There is never a time to stop recruiting. That's my view anyway. I don't know what you got.
What I didn't say was, even with early involvement, what happens to me is the application lands on me, maybe it's on a Friday, and somebody wants it fast turnaround to get it through straight away. So that's my beef. PPI isn't straightforward, as we all know. And I will give you one tip today that I have noticed. I cannot help being critical even of this, and that is that quite often on a slide, I could have done with the PPI member's name there, and the same with the posters. I mean, you can't always do it, but there may be times when you can do it. Thanks.
GJ, do you want to?
Yeah.
I think
We're ready to wrap up? Yeah.
oh, we're not quite. 3 minutes to go.
3 minutes to go. Okay.
Anybody else?
Thanks. Yeah, just while we're on the when, I just wanted to add, we found it really encouraging, the comment that was made that obviously ideally from the beginning, but it's never too late. That was, you know, because sometimes for whatever reason, because of timelines, because you don't have the budget, it is difficult at the beginning, but then don't kind of give up and think, oh, well, we've missed the opportunity. And I think the other observation is sometimes you can be super enthusiastic at the beginning and get all the involvement going, and then maybe it tails off a little bit when you start, you know, panicking about deadlines. And so, yeah, just some really helpful comments there. Thank you. Yeah.
Sometimes, to be perfectly honest, especially if we're involved right at the very, very beginning, doing the application and so on, what can happen then is the application can maybe can falter, can stall, can whatever, and then we're sitting there thinking, whatever happened to that? So, you know, please give us a bit of feedback as well. So if it does fail, let us know. Maybe we can get heads together and think of another way of applying for funding. I've done that before, and I'm sure plenty of people here as well. Just because we're just members of the public doesn't mean we don't know a little bit about the way these things work. We're learning as we go on. Okay. Yeah.
So I'd like to just take a moment to thank all of our public partners and our colleagues who've shared today. Thank you all so much for your